Everyone in the neighborhood thought they knew me. Quiet, polite, the kind of person who kept to herself, who mowed her lawn on Saturdays and waved at passing cars. But that morning, as the sun crept over the rooftops, everything I thought I knew about safety and civility began to crumble. I remember standing at my kitchen window, coffee in hand, and noticing a black SUV idling just past my mailbox. A sense of unease settled in my chest, the kind that whispers something isn't right. I had been living in the neighborhood for years, paying my dues, respecting the rules, never causing trouble. But the HOA, well, the HOA had other plans. I'd received letters before, the usual friendly reminders that carried the sharp sting of threat if ignored. But this one was different. It wasn't just a letter. It was a summons, a warning, a demand. They wanted me to join their little club, control disguised as community, and they weren't going to ask nicely. The SUV's engine hummed, low and steady, like a heartbeat measuring my own fear. My dog, Shotgun, sensed it too. He was a massive German shepherd, loyal to a fault, his ears perking and tail stiffening as he growled low in his throat. He had been with me through everything, long nights when I felt alone, walks in the rain, and moments when the world seemed determined to test me. But even he could sense that today would be different. The doorbell rang, sharp, insistent. I froze, staring at it as though hesitation could make the sound go away. Shotgun positioned himself between me and the door, his body tense, ready. My heart raced as I debated whether to peek through the peephole or to call someone, but instinct won. I edged toward the door, hand trembling over the knob, and when I looked through, I didn't see a friendly neighbor. I saw three men, rough around the edges, eyes calculating, hands in their pockets like they were weighing the threat I posed. They spoke my name, each word measured and cold. "Time to join," one said like it was a command, not a suggestion. My mind spun, searching for a way to defuse this. Who called them? How far would they go? But before I could answer, Shotgun lunged forward with a growl that shook the air. The thug stumbled back, surprised by the sheer force of him, by the intensity in his eyes. It was like he was speaking for me, saying without words, "You don't belong here. You won't pass." Fear and adrenaline collided in my chest. I realized in that moment that I couldn't just hope this would pass. I had to stand firm. I had to be smarter, faster, braver. I grabbed my phone, dialing the sheriff with a hand that refused to stop shaking. I had heard stories of HOA overreach, of neighbors being bullied into submission, but I had never imagined it would come to this. People sent to intimidate me into compliance. It was surreal, terrifying, and somehow empowering all at once. While I waited for the sheriff, I watched as the men regrouped, clearly debating their next move. Shotgun stayed alert, a living wall between me and them, growling low, each exhale deliberate and threatening. I whispered to him, "Good boy, just a little longer," feeling the strange mix of fear and pride. Even in the face of danger, there was a strange clarity in knowing I wasn't alone. The sun climbed higher, shadows stretching across my lawn, but the SUV remained silent and watchful. I thought about the letters I had received, the subtle threats tucked into polite sentences. The HOA thought they could control me, bend me to their rules, scare me into compliance. They didn't know about Shotgun. They didn't know I had a line they couldn't cross. And they definitely didn't know the sheriff was on his way. Every second felt like an eternity. I replayed scenarios in my mind, the perfect mix of calm and courage, wondering if I'd have to fight, if I'd have to run, if I'd ever feel safe here again. The men's eyes darted toward the street repeatedly, measuring the distance, calculating risks. And then I heard it, the distant but unmistakable wail of a siren. Relief surged through me, but it was tempered by fear. What would happen when they realized help was coming? Would they leave? Would they escalate? Shotgun sensed it too. His growl softened, but only slightly, a warning that the storm wasn't over yet. I took a deep breath, feeling my pulse gradually settle, the adrenaline ebbing just enough for me to think clearly. I realized something crucial in that moment. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is standing firm when every instinct tells you to run, when the world seems poised against you. And as I waited, holding the leash of a dog who was more than a pet, my protector, my family, I knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to back down. And then the sheriff's cruiser appeared around the corner, lights flashing, the sound cutting through the tension like a promise. The SUV's engine roared once, then fell silent. The men glanced at each other, their confidence wavering. For the first time that morning, I allowed myself a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was about to end. But as they say, the calm before the storm is never truly calm. The cruiser's lights sliced through the morning haze, painting the street in urgent streaks of red and blue. My stomach twisted with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because someone was finally here to stop the intimidation. Dread, because I had no idea how this would play out. The thugs hadn't expected anyone to intervene. They hadn't counted on consequences beyond the thin line of control they tried to impose. Shotgun remained steadfast, ears pricked, muscles coiled like springs. He was aware of the tension, the unspoken question hanging between all of us. Who blinks first? I crouched slightly, resting my hand on his massive shoulder, feeling the heat of his body. The comfort was both grounding and empowering. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing for everything I believed in, for the right to live without fear on my own property. The sheriff stepped out of the cruiser, a tall figure of calm authority, and called out to the men, "Step back, now!" His voice was measured, but it carried weight, every syllable a line in the invisible boundary that had just been drawn. The thugs hesitated, glancing at each other, uncertainty creeping into their posture. They were used to intimidation, not resistance, not law enforcement, not a German shepherd that radiated protective fury. I watched silently, heart pounding, as the men exchanged whispers. I didn't catch the words, but I understood the sentiment. This wasn't supposed to happen. One of them stepped forward, attempting bravado, but Shotgun's growl rattled the air, deep and warning. Even the sheriff raised an eyebrow at the display, a small smirk of understanding passing across his face. I felt a swell of pride for my dog, for the bond we shared. In that moment, it wasn't just protection. It was trust, courage, and an unspoken declaration: "You do not scare us." And yet, beneath the pride, there was fear. The fear that this confrontation could escalate, that these people sent to force me into compliance might not retreat quietly, that the day my peace could be shattered in a heartbeat. The sheriff approached slowly, hands visible, eyes scanning, reading the tension like a map. He gestured for me to stay back, which I did, though every muscle in my body wanted to run into action, to confront the threat head-on. But I trusted him. For once, I had an ally who understood the stakes and the subtle dangers lurking behind the veil of civility that the HOA had constructed. "Are you alone?" the sheriff asked, voice low, deliberate. His question wasn't just about numbers, it was about understanding the depth of the threat. "No," I said quietly. "Shotgun is with me." He looked at my dog, nodding slightly. "Good boy," he muttered under his breath, as if acknowledging a fellow warrior in this silent battle. The thugs had shifted uneasily, realizing that the narrative they had carefully rehearsed, the narrative of fear and dominance, was crumbling. The rules of engagement had changed. Time slowed. Every second stretched, heavy with possibility. One wrong move could ignite chaos. Yet in that stillness I felt clarity. The intimidation wasn't just about me. It was about the principle, the idea that people could be coerced into obedience. The HOA thought they could dictate compliance with threats and whispers behind polished letters and polite meetings. But courage, real courage, sometimes comes wrapped in ordinary bodies and everyday lives. Sometimes it comes with fur and loyalty, with quiet defiance that refuses to bow. I remembered the letters I'd ignored for months, the polite threats that masked menace. At the time, I had felt frustration, maybe even resignation. But now, seeing the fear mirrored in the eyes of these intruders, I realized that ignoring them wasn't cowardice. It was preparation. It was building resilience silently in the shadows until the moment arrived when it mattered most. The SUV's engine started again, slow and deliberate, as if the men were contemplating retreat. But the sheriff's presence held them in place. He didn't move aggressively, he didn't yell. He simply stood there, a pillar of authority, and the weight of the law hung over them like a blade suspended by a thread. I realized with a mixture of fear and awe that sometimes power doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply exists, and others step back because they know it cannot be challenged without consequence. One of the men finally stepped backward, hands raised slightly, a silent surrender. The others followed, tension crackling in the air like a storm about to break. Shotgun's growl softened, still alert but no longer defensive. Relief surged through me, but it was cautious, measured. This wasn't victory yet. It was only the first acknowledgement that the fight wasn't one-sided. The sheriff turned to me, voice gentle but firm. "You did everything right. Your dog did exactly what was needed and you stayed calm. That's how you protect yourself." I nodded, swallowing hard, emotions churning, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and lingering fear. I realized in that moment that courage isn't a single act. It's a series of choices. It's staying present when the world tries to dictate your fear. It's trusting yourself, your instincts, and sometimes your dog. And then, as the men retreated toward their SUV, a thought struck me. The HOA may have thought they could control me. They may have thought fear would bend me. But they had underestimated the bonds that matter, the loyalty, the courage, and the quiet defiance that lives inside ordinary people when pushed too far. As the sheriff called in their license plate and the SUV disappeared down the street, I stood on my porch, feeling the weight lift slowly. But even with the immediate danger gone, the neighborhood felt different now. I had crossed a line I never intended to cross, and I knew that this confrontation, this moment of defiance, would leave a mark on me, on them, and on the quiet truth that sometimes standing up isn't just necessary. It's inevitable. Why did she think she could control everything? The question kept spinning in my mind long after the SUV disappeared down the street. She, the woman behind the letters, the demands, the fear, Karen, as everyone quietly called her, was supposed to be a neighbor. Someone we waved to at community barbecues, someone whose life was, in theory, intertwined with ours by civility and shared streets. But the truth was darker. She thrived on control, on power. On the quiet intimidation that convinced ordinary people they weren't allowed to say no. I sat in my living room, shotgun's head resting on my lap, and tried to breathe. The sheriff had left with the promise of follow-up, of investigation, of justice. But the adrenaline hadn't faded. My heart still hammered in my chest. I thought about Karen, her voice dripping with false sweetness when she sent her letters, the way she smiled at neighbors as if hiding secrets behind her perfectly polished nails. And then I thought about the men she had sent. Not her hands, perhaps, but her will behind them. I realized that this wasn't just about a dispute over HOA membership. It was about dignity, about autonomy, about the simple right to live without fear in a place that was supposed to feel like home. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the fight wasn't over. Karen wouldn't stop. She couldn't. Her identity was tied to dominance, to pushing boundaries, to seeing others crumble under pressure, and I wasn't going to crumble. That evening the street was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, almost watchful. Shotgun prowled near the windows, alert to every shadow, every rustle of leaves, as if sensing that Karen's influence stretched farther than I could see. I remembered what the sheriff had said. She has resources, people listen to her, but she's human. And humans, when faced with unexpected resistance, often miscalculate. I smiled, a mixture of relief and grim determination. Unexpected resistance. That's exactly what I had become. And if Karen thought a few intimidating men could bend me, she had another thing coming. The next day, the letters resumed. They slid silently under my door, perfectly printed, the typeface designed to feel polite, yet underneath, the words dripped with coercion. Compliance is expected. Membership ensures community harmony. I read it, crumpled it, and placed it on the counter. Shotgun sat beside me, eyes sharp. He was a reminder that fear didn't have to win. That strength came in many forms, sometimes in fists, sometimes in loyalty, sometimes in the quiet defiance of staying put. But Karen wasn't done. She began showing up at community events, always with that pristine smile and those piercing eyes, as if testing me, watching for cracks. The neighbors nodded politely, afraid to cross her. But I noticed something in their eyes, curiosity, doubt, and in a few, quiet admiration. Perhaps they recognized that standing up wasn't weakness. Perhaps they were learning in small, cautious steps that courage could ripple outward. I started documenting everything. Letters, encounters, strange vehicles parked near my house. Every detail mattered. Even small things became weapons in this invisible war, proof that the rules she tried to enforce weren't just arbitrary, they were manipulated. And every evening, Shotgun and I walked the perimeter, surveying our territory, reminding ourselves that home wasn't just a place. It was defended by vigilance, by courage, by refusing to be bent. Karen's tactics escalated subtly. She would send neighbors by with vague warnings, hints that my actions were unneighborly. Or that it would be better for everyone if every word was calculated, meant to unsettle, to erode confidence. I realized then something I hadn't fully understood before. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, and it's far more dangerous that way. But I wasn't listening to fear. I was listening to Shotgun's steady breathing, to the sheriff's advice, to my own instincts. And I was learning a vital truth. Standing your ground isn't just physical, it's psychological. It's refusing to internalize the pressure, refusing to let others dictate your sense of right and wrong. It's about holding a line that isn't visible, but that can't be crossed without consequence. One night, as the moon hung low and silver over the rooftops, I saw Karen's SUV idling again just past the curve of the street. My pulse quickened, but I didn't panic. Shotgun rose, muscles coiled, ears forward. I grabbed my phone and dialed the sheriff once more. There was a strange serenity in that moment, clarity born from preparation and resolve. The confrontation wasn't over, but for the first time I didn't feel helpless. I felt alive. I thought about the neighbors who had whispered behind closed doors, worried about HOA reprisals. I thought about my own fears and how facing them had changed me. Courage wasn't about confrontation alone. It was about integrity, about staying true to yourself even when the world seemed designed to pull you into compliance. And in the quiet of that night with shotgun at my side, I realized something vital. Power is fleeting, but courage is enduring. Karen would try again. She always did. But she hadn't counted on the unexpected resistance. She hadn't accounted for loyalty, for the law, for a dog who understood the stakes better than most humans. And she hadn't understood me. That was her mistake, and it would cost her more than she imagined. The knock came at the door again, but this time it was different. Louder, more deliberate, not polite, not a request. A challenge. My stomach tightened as shotgun rose instantly, ears forward, tail stiff, every muscle taut. The morning sun slanted across the porch, glinting off the metal of the doorknob, and I realized that nothing about this day would be ordinary. Not anymore. The letters, the whispers, the intimidating SUV, they had all been practice. This was the real test. The proof that Karen wasn't satisfied with sending proxies, that she needed to see, to feel, to impose. And now she had escalated. The thugs had returned, likely emboldened, thinking the sheriff's earlier visit was a warning, not a boundary. But they had underestimated one thing, one being. I crouched slightly behind the door, hand on shotgun's broad back. He let out a low, rumbling growl that shook the quiet morning air. I whispered, "Stay calm, let's see who's brave enough to come closer." The doorbell rang again, then the knock, louder this time, almost aggressive. I felt the sweat prickling at my temples, the tight coil of anxiety in my chest. Fear wasn't gone, but it was tempered now, edged with resolve. The sheriff's words echoed in my mind. Courage is not the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. And acting, I realized, sometimes required letting your fiercest ally, the one who never wavered, lead the charge. Shotgun shifted slightly, muscles coiled, eyes locked on the shadows at the edge of the porch. The thugs hadn't moved. They hadn't expected the intensity radiating from him. And then the first man stepped forward, confident, cocky. But as soon as shotgun barked, a sound that was more roar than canine voice, he froze. His eyes widened, scanning for an exit, as if realizing that the situation had changed. The other two men hesitated behind him, suddenly unsure. This was supposed to be simple, just a scare. A shove toward compliance, but fear had a way of flipping roles. I opened the door just slightly, enough to see the tension, enough to gauge the threat. "I'm done talking," I said softly, my voice calm but deliberate. "You will leave." The first man laughed nervously, trying to mask the unease creeping across his features. He took a step closer. That was the mistake. Shotgun lunged, teeth bared, a blur of power and precision that forced the intruder back with a stumble. The other two men tried to approach, but the growl intensified, a wave of authority that left no room for negotiation. I could feel my pulse, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that sharpened my awareness. Every movement, every breath, every eye flick of the intruders was under scrutiny. They were measuring, calculating, realizing that they were in over their heads. The sheriff's cruiser appeared again, lights cutting across the street. I had called him before the confrontation, knowing instinctively that this escalation would require official backup. The men's eyes flicked to the cruiser and their confidence faltered. They hadn't expected law enforcement to arrive so quickly. They hadn't expected a dog like Shotgun or a woman unwilling to bow. One of them reached into his pocket, and for a split second, panic surged through me. But then I realized it wasn't a weapon, it was a phone. Likely calling Karen, reporting that the plan wasn't working. They were improvising, scrambling, and that, perhaps more than Shotgun's growl or the sheriff's arrival, showed the cracks in their control. The sheriff stepped out of the cruiser, hand on his holster but not aggressive, his presence enough to assert authority. "Step back," he commanded. The men hesitated. Then slowly, one by one, they retreated toward the SUV, each glance a mixture of frustration and fear. Shotgun remained vigilant, growling low, a final warning that home was defended and that this line could not be crossed. I leaned against the doorframe, chest heaving, feeling the weight of relief wash over me. But underneath it, a quiet, simmering anger pulsed. This wasn't just about a confrontation with a few hired men. This was about Karen, the person who had orchestrated it all. The puppet master, hidden behind perfectly manicured nails and sweet smiles, who believed she could bend me, intimidate me, control me. And I realized something vital. Courage doesn't just repel immediate threats. It exposes the architecture of control. It forces the puppeteer into the open. And in that moment, standing on my porch, shotgun at my side with the law and my own resolve as allies, I understood that Karen's influence could only reach as far as people allowed it. And I wasn't allowing it. The SUV pulled away, tires crunching over gravel, leaving silence in its wake. I stepped outside fully, feeling the warmth of the morning sun, the quiet pride in Shotgun's steady gaze. We had faced the threat together and survived, but the battle wasn't over. Karen still loomed, her letters, her whispers, her attempts to dominate the neighborhood. Yet something had shifted. The narrative had changed. The fear she tried to cultivate had met resistance. Courage, in its raw, unyielding form, had pushed back, and I knew that next time I would be ready. For the first time, I realized the truth. Power is fleeting. Fear is temporary, but courage, the courage to stand, to protect, to refuse submission, that endures. And as Shotgun and I returned inside, the neighborhood quiet around us, I felt a small but undeniable victory. The fight had begun, and I was ready. The street was quiet, almost eerily so, but I knew that calm was deceptive. After the confrontation, after the SUV had disappeared and the sheriff had left, I expected relief. I expected a sense of closure. But the truth was far more complicated. Karen didn't operate in obvious ways. She was patient, strategic, relentless. The letters had resumed almost immediately, polished, threatening, insidious. Every sentence carefully crafted to chip away at my resolve, to remind me that the battle wasn't over. I sat at my kitchen table, shotgun at my feet, paw occasionally brushing against my ankle, and reread the latest note. Community harmony requires participation. Noncompliance has consequences. The words were sterile on the page, but the weight behind them was undeniable. I could almost hear Karen's voice, smooth and authoritative, imagining the satisfaction she would feel knowing that she had pushed, nudged, tested me. But I was different now. The confrontation had changed me. I understood something vital. Fear is only effective if it isolates you. Courage, however, multiplies when it is shared. The sheriff had been more than a presence. He had been a reminder that the law could intervene, that systems existed to protect those who refused to be intimidated. Shotgun had been more than a dog. He had been a living embodiment of loyalty and courage, unyielding and fierce. Together, we had rewritten the rules of engagement. The neighborhood, however, hadn't fully adjusted to this new dynamic. I could feel the subtle shifts, the cautious glances from neighbors, the polite avoidance of eye contact, the half-whispered questions about what had happened. Some were curious, some wary, others quietly admiring the courage they had witnessed. And then there were those who sided with Karen, drawn by the allure of power, afraid to question her authority. One afternoon, as I stepped outside to water the garden, I noticed a familiar car parked a little too close to my driveway. My heart sank, but Shotgun immediately stiffened, his gaze locked on the vehicle. He had learned quickly that vigilance was survival. I didn't approach the car. Instead, I observed, silent and deliberate. The driver, a young man I hadn't met before, watched me intently before driving off slowly, glancing over his shoulder as if confirming my reaction. It was subtle, but it was enough. Karen's influence was persistent. She was testing me, probing for weaknesses. Every day became a psychological chess match. Letters, unexpected visitors, thinly veiled threats masked as community concern. And each day I responded not with fear, but with careful, deliberate resistance. I documented every encounter, logged every suspicious vehicle, every whispered rumor. I began to notice patterns, small signals that revealed Karen's strategies. She relied on predictability, on fear of social ostracism, on the illusion of authority. And the more I resisted, the more her tactics escalated, as if she couldn't comprehend that one person might refuse to bend. Through it all, Shotgun remained my constant companion, a reminder that courage isn't abstract. It's tangible, living, and fiercely loyal. When I lay awake at night, listening to the quiet of the house, I could hear his breathing, steady and grounding, a rhythm that anchored me against the anxiety Karen tried to instill. Courage, I realized, isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, persistent, unyielding, the decision to remain steadfast when every signal in the world encourages surrender. And then came the meeting. The HOA had scheduled it with what they thought was innocent timing, a chance to pressure me further under the guise of community engagement. I knew about it in advance, thanks to a neighbor who whispered a warning. I didn't go. Instead, I prepared. Shotgun and I walked the perimeter of the house, double-checked locks and cameras, and reviewed every step of the confrontation in my mind. This wasn't about fear. It was about preparation, about controlling what I could when faced with unpredictability. That night, as I sat on the porch with Shotgun, the quiet street stretching before me, I realized something profound. Karen's power was real, but only in the moments people allowed it. Courage, even in the face of constant pressure, chipped away at that power. Each day, each act of resistance was a small victory, a declaration that I would not be defined by fear, that the narrative she tried to control could be rewritten. I also understood the deeper lesson. Sometimes the most significant battles are invisible. No one else saw the weight of each letter, the tension in each encounter, the constant calculation required just to maintain a sense of normalcy. But the battle mattered nonetheless. Courage isn't always recognized. Sometimes it's a quiet defiance, a refusal to yield, a living testament that boundaries cannot be imposed without consent. And in that quiet moment, I made a decision. Karen would continue her tactics, she would continue to probe, but I would not allow her to dictate my life. The sheriff would remain informed, Shotgun would remain vigilant, and I would continue to document, to observe, to resist. This neighborhood might never be completely free from her influence, but within my home, within my mind, I had drawn a line that no one would cross. Sometimes I thought, the strongest victories aren't explosive. They're the ones that quietly endure, that persist against intimidation, that survive the relentless pressure of someone determined to break you. That night, with Shotgun by my side and the letters stacked unread on the counter, I felt the first taste of that enduring strength. Karen might still loom, but I had found mine. And that, I realized, was the beginning of real power. The morning air felt heavier than usual, thick with anticipation. Something had shifted overnight. I could feel it before I saw it, the subtle vibrations of a neighborhood holding its breath. Even the birds seemed quieter, cautious. Shotgun's ears twitched constantly, muscles coiled under my touch. I had learned to read him like a mirror. When he sensed unease, it meant trouble was near. And trouble, I realized with a tightening chest, had a name: Karen. Her influence had always been pervasive, subtle, suffocating. But now it was escalating. A neighbor whispered that she had others, a small coalition of like-minded enforcers who believed that compliance was mandatory, that dissent was dangerous. I walked through the streets carefully, every glance over my shoulder, every casual encounter a potential threat. Yet beneath the fear, I felt something else, an unshakable determination. I had faced the men before, I had faced the threat. And now I understood something vital. Resistance had consequences, but so did submission. The HOA sent another note, this one more formal, demanding my attendance at an emergency meeting. "Your cooperation is essential for community unity," it read. On the surface, it seemed bureaucratic, dry, but the tone carried weight, a subtle pressure that said, "We see you. We are coming." I placed the letter on the counter beside the previous ones, a growing stack that chronicled the silent war Karen waged. Shotgun lay nearby, head raised, eyes alert, as if sensing that the next move would be decisive. Neighbors began to act differently too. Some avoided me outright, afraid of being associated with my defiance. Others watched from behind curtains, curiosity tinged with worry. A few, however, nodded subtly when we passed, small gestures of solidarity that spoke volumes. Courage, I realized, was contagious. The act of standing firm rippled outward, challenging the carefully constructed fear that Karen had built over years. And every time someone witnessed it, a crack appeared in her control. That afternoon, I heard footsteps near the driveway. Slow, deliberate. I peeked through the blinds and saw a car parked just beyond the edge of my yard. 3 men emerged, different faces than before, but the same air of authority and intimidation. They approached methodically, scanning windows, measuring distance, testing boundaries. My pulse spiked, but I remained calm. I had rehearsed this in my mind countless times. This was no longer about surprise. It was about preparation, strategy, and the unshakable bond between me and my protector. Shotgun stood immediately, growl low and rumbling, body tense. I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the clarity that comes when survival meets courage. These men were sent to test me, to see if fear would bend me. But fear had no purchase here, not when loyalty, strategy, and sheer resolve stood between them and their target. I picked up the phone, ready to call the sheriff if needed, but I also knew that confrontation could be subtle. Sometimes resistance was quiet, strategic, almost invisible. I opened the door slightly, letting Shotgun's presence dominate the space, a living warning that home was not just a place, it was defended. The men paused, taken aback. They hadn't expected this. Their confidence faltered, small hesitations creeping into their movements. The psychological game had begun. I could see the calculations behind their eyes. How aggressive can we be? Will she cave? I didn't move, didn't speak. Shotgun's eyes locked on them, unwavering, his low growl a statement louder than any words. The men exchanged glances, a subtle acknowledgement that this encounter was not going according to plan. And then, as if by unspoken command, they retreated toward their car, glancing over their shoulders but not returning to the fight. Later that evening, I walked through the neighborhood, Shotgun at my side, reflecting on the subtle victories. Karen's influence was pervasive, but it wasn't absolute. The cracks were widening. The neighbors who had feared retaliation now hesitated. Some dared to question her tactics. Some whispered support when no one else was listening. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but I realized that courage, once sparked, had a way of spreading quietly, inexorably, like roots breaking through concrete. And yet the battle was far from over. Karen's strategies were adaptable, relentless, designed to wear people down gradually. I knew she would push harder, escalate further, and exploit any perceived weakness. But I had learned something essential. Fear only rules when it is allowed to dominate thought and action. Resistance, when coupled with clarity and loyalty, could create its own kind of power. That night, as I sat on the porch with Shotgun curled at my feet, I felt the weight of what we had accomplished, and the enormity of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about letters or intimidation. It was about standing firm against a system designed to enforce compliance, about proving that dignity and courage were worth more than fear and submission. And in that moment, under the silver light of the moon, I understood something profound. The strongest victories are not explosive. They are enduring, persistent, and built quietly, day by day, paw by paw, step by step. Shotgun yawned, eyes closing, yet still alert. I leaned back, hand on his head, feeling a rare sense of peace. Karen might continue to loom, might escalate her tactics, but within my home, within my mind, the line had been drawn. Fear would not dictate the terms. Courage, loyalty, and careful resistance would. And that, I realized, was a victory she could never take away. The sun hung low over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across manicured lawns, but the warmth of the day did little to ease the tension coiling in my chest. I could feel it even before I saw the SUV creeping slowly down the street. Karen's enforcers had returned, and this time they weren't subtle. They were deliberate, their presence a statement. We will not be ignored. I stepped onto the porch, Shotgun at my side, muscles taut and growling low. My hand rested on his broad back, grounding both of us. Every letter, every whispered threat, every carefully documented encounter had led to this moment. I wasn't just defending my home. I was defending my dignity, my autonomy, and the principle that fear has no right to dictate life. The men stepped out of the SUV, their movements confident, rehearsed. But confidence, I had learned, could crumble in an instant when faced with unexpected resistance. Shotgun growled, a low, resonant warning that vibrated through the morning air. I whispered, "Hold steady, wait for it." His gaze never wavered from the intruders, as if reading their intentions before they themselves fully understood them. The first man advanced, trying to appear authoritative, but every step betrayed hesitation. He expected compliance, silence, fear. Instead, he found unwavering defiance. Shotgun shifted forward slightly, a controlled display of power that froze him in place. The second and third men hesitated behind him, calculating, uncertain. And then I saw her, Karen. She had arrived in her SUV, perfectly timed, perfectly composed, her expression unreadable. She stepped out gracefully, the picture of civility, and approached the group. But her eyes met mine, and in that glance I saw something she hadn't expected, recognition. Recognition that I wouldn't bend, wouldn't cower, wouldn't submit. and for a fraction of a second the facade of control flickered. She spoke, voice sweet, measured, designed to charm and simultaneously. "You know you don't have to make this difficult." But the words fell flat. They didn't hold power anymore. Shotgun growled, a deep rumble that underscored the tension. The men shifted uneasily, sensing the fragility in the authority they had once believed absolute. I stepped forward slightly, my voice calm, deliberate. "I don't respond to intimidation, and neither will anyone else here." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't bravado. It was a statement of truth, a line drawn in the morning light. And that truth, I realized, carried more weight than any letter or whispered warning Karen could conjure. The sheriff's cruiser arrived moments later, lights cutting through the tension like a beacon. Karen's enforcers glanced toward it, their confidence faltering. The sheriff stepped out, calm, authoritative, and in that instant the balance of power shifted. What had been a psychological siege transformed into a tangible confrontation with consequences. Karen's face tightened ever so slightly. The smile remained, but the eyes, those calculating eyes, betrayed unease. The letters, the whispers, the intimidation had been her tools, her weapons, but they were ineffective against the combination of law, courage, and loyalty standing firm before her. Shotgun, muscles coiled and teeth bared, was more than a dog. He was a living testament to the principle Karen had ignored. Fear cannot dominate when courage refuses to yield. The men she had sent began to retreat, glancing over their shoulders, uncertain. Karen's hands tightened at her sides, and for the first time I saw hesitation, not the poised authority she had cultivated, but doubt. She had underestimated me, underestimated the stakes, underestimated the strength born from fear faced and overcome. The sheriff approached, voice measured. "Leave, now." The command carried the weight of law and consequence, and the SUV's doors slammed shut, tires crunching over gravel as the group drove away. Karen lingered briefly, eyes narrowing before retreating to her car. But the narrative had shifted irrevocably. Her influence had limits, and today those limits had been exposed. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain, but beneath the relief a quiet resolve. Karen would continue to test boundaries, to push, to probe. But she had learned something essential. I would not be intimidated. Fear would not dictate my life. Courage, quiet, persistent, unwavering, had the power to rewrite the rules. Shotgun leaned against my leg, tail wagging slowly, a subtle but clear acknowledgement of victory. I knelt, resting my hand on his head, feeling the warmth, the loyalty, the shared triumph. Courage, I realized, is often silent. It doesn't roar, it simply persists, and today it had prevailed. Neighbors emerged cautiously from behind curtains and fences, some clapping quietly, some offering nods of admiration. I realized that courage is contagious. The ripple had begun. Karen's power, built over years of subtle manipulation, had met a force she could not overcome: integrity and steadfastness. And in that moment, standing on my porch, sunlight slanting across the yard, shotgun at my side, I understood something profound. Fear has limits. Power has limits. But courage, loyal, persistent, unwavering courage, endures. It protects, it inspires, it transforms. And sometimes it even changes a neighborhood. The neighborhood felt different that evening, though nothing had changed physically. The same streets stretched out before me, the same houses lined the curbs, the same wind stirred the leaves. Yet the atmosphere was subtly altered, charged with something I couldn't see but could feel: possibility. Karen's shadow had not vanished entirely. She never would. But the fear she cultivated had been exposed, challenged, and contained. I sat on the porch, shotgun curled at my feet, the weight of the past weeks pressing gently on my shoulders. Every knock, every letter, every tense glance across the street replayed in my mind. But instead of anxiety, I felt clarity. I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before: courage isn't loud. Courage isn't a momentary flare of defiance. Courage is quiet, steadfast, persistent, enduring through every day, every challenge, every subtle test. Shotgun lifted his head and looked at me, eyes full of loyalty and intelligence, and I realized that he had been my teacher as much as my protector. The bond we shared had made all the difference: the steady presence, the unwavering vigilance, the silent reassurance that fear was not an option. I reached down and scratched behind his ears, feeling the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breath. Together, we had survived something that seemed insurmountable. The sheriff had called earlier that day, reporting that Karen's enforcers had been traced back to her, and that the HOA would be facing serious scrutiny. Official complaints were filed, and legal channels had been triggered. For once, the machinery of law and accountability aligned with personal courage. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. A reminder that standing firm, documenting truth, and refusing submission carries weight, even against entrenched systems of control. Neighbors began to emerge more openly. I noticed subtle changes in their behavior, small smiles, cautious nods, whispers of admiration. Some had dared to challenge Karen's influence in private meetings, emboldened by the knowledge that resistance was possible. I realized then that courage is not just personal, it is contagious. One act of defiance can ripple outward, reshaping the dynamics of an entire community. Even now, I felt a cautious optimism, tempered by the understanding that vigilance was still necessary. Karen would try to reclaim control. She would continue her subtle campaigns, her carefully phrased letters, her attempts to manipulate perception. But the balance had shifted irrevocably. Her tools, the fear she wielded so efficiently, no longer had power over me, and I had shown the neighborhood that resistance was possible, that courage could endure. As twilight fell, the flickered on, casting pools of golden light across the asphalt. I walked shotgun along the familiar path, feeling the crisp air against my skin, listening to the soft crunch of gravel beneath our feet. Each step felt lighter than the last, not because the battle was over, but because I had reclaimed control of my own life, my own space. Fear no longer dictated the terms. Courage had. I thought about the letters stacked neatly on my counter, each one a testament to the challenges I had faced. They had arrived with an expectation, submission, but they had been met with vigilance, with loyalty, with courage. And now they sat ignored, powerless in the face of persistent resistance. I realized something profound. The strongest walls are built not from fear, but from integrity and determination. Shotgun paused, sniffing the air, ears twitching. I smiled, knowing he sensed the subtle shift too, the quiet acknowledgement that, for now, home was secure. Not because danger had vanished entirely, but because courage had been proven effective. Fear could no longer claim dominion over this place, not while loyalty and resolve stood guard. The sheriff had offered words of encouragement, but it was Shotgun and I who had truly embodied them, courage in action. Not in the absence of fear, but in the steadfast refusal to let fear control our choices. And as I returned to the porch, feeling the gentle weight of dusk settling over the street, I understood the final lesson this chapter had delivered. Power built on intimidation is fragile. Courage built on integrity endures. Neighbors' eyes met mine across fences and driveways, small gestures of recognition, quiet affirmations that the tide was shifting. Karen's influence had been checked, her reach diminished, but most importantly, the lesson was clear. Fear cannot prevail when courage persists. The story of intimidation had ended, not with loud confrontation or explosive action, but with quiet, steadfast, unyielding resolve. I leaned back in my chair, Shotgun resting his head in my lap, and let the evening settle around us. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the soft sounds of life continuing, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. And in that quiet moment I felt it fully. The triumph was not just survival, it was reclamation. Courage had prevailed, loyalty had endured, and I had discovered something vital about myself, about fear, and about the quiet, unshakable power of refusing to bow. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to exhale completely. The neighborhood would continue, life would move forward, and the story of that small street, of fear, resistance, and ultimate courage, would linger in the shadows, a quiet testament to the power of standing firm, of defending home, of refusing to be intimidated. And as Shotgun lifted his head and licked my hand, I smiled, knowing this chapter had been won, not by violence, not by anger, but by courage that refused to waver, courage that endured, and courage that, quietly but undeniably, had transformed everything.